Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It started with a glance, simple, fleeting, but enough to ignite a series of events I never saw coming. We were at a neighborhood barbecue, surrounded by laughter, sizzling grills, and the scent of summer. I held my husband's hand, feeling content in the life we'd built. Then I saw it. A glance exchanged between him and Lily, our neighbor. It wasn't the casual acknowledgement neighbors share. No, it lingered, just a second too long. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining things, letting my insecurities play tricks. But something about the way his eyes softened when he looked at her lodged itself in my mind. It was like watching a whisper with no words. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, we were happy, weren't we? We had our routines, our inside jokes, the comfort of shared memories. But that glance had planted a seed of doubt, and once planted, doubt grows in silence, watered by every small detail you can't ignore. Later that evening, as we cleaned up, I mentioned how friendly Lily was. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze, mumbling something about her being just a neighbor. I laughed it off, but inside, a storm was brewing. I didn't know it then, but that glance was the crack in the glass. Small, almost invisible. But over time, pressure finds the weakness. And eventually, everything shatters. Weeks passed, but the memory of that glance stayed with me. I noticed little changes, subtle shifts in his routine. Late nights at the office, unexplained meetings, and a new habit of checking his phone with a guarded look. I wanted to believe his excuses. I really did. But love doesn't erase instincts. It just makes you question them. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when our marriage had started to feel like a puzzle with missing pieces. One evening, he came home later than usual, claiming traffic had been terrible. But his shirt smelled faintly of perfume, not mine. I didn't confront him. Instead, I buried the suspicion deep, convincing myself it was stress, overthinking, anything but what it truly was. We became strangers sharing a bed. I'd watch him sleep, his face peaceful, while my mind raced with questions I was too afraid to ask. Love is funny like that. It can blind you, make you complicit in your own heartbreak. Lily became a constant presence. She'd wave from her porch, her smile warm and inviting. Too warm, too inviting. She'd stop by with homemade cookies, casual conversations, and that laugh. Light, musical, and, to me, filled with secrets. My husband always seemed a little too eager to help her with things. A leaky faucet, a broken fence. I told myself he was just being neighborly. But deep down, I felt the walls of our marriage closing in. I tried to befriend her, to understand what made her so magnetic. She was charming, yes, but there was an edge, a confidence that unnerved me. She didn't seem to recognize boundaries, and my husband didn't seem to mind. One day, I saw them laughing together in the driveway, lost in their own little world. They didn't notice me watching. That moment was the confirmation I didn't want. But denial is a powerful thing. I still wasn't ready to face the truth. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. He left his phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked. Curiosity, mixed with suspicion, got the better of me. I picked it up, telling myself I'd find nothing. But I did. Messages from Lily, flirty, bold, unapologetic. Last night was amazing. My hands trembled as I scrolled, reading the words that dismantled our life in real time. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, heartbreak, disbelief. But mostly, I felt foolish. How had I missed the signs? When he came home, I tried to act normal. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to process the betrayal, to understand the depth of it before I faced him. That night, I lay beside him, the weight of his lies pressing down on me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The words spilled out, sharp and raw. "Are you having an affair with Lily?" He didn't deny it immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. Then came the lies, clumsy, desperate attempts to rewrite the truth. "You're imagining things. She's just a friend." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted away, filled with guilt he couldn't hide. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, feeling the last thread of our marriage snap. After that night, everything felt different, like the air had shifted and I could no longer breathe freely. He promised he'd stop seeing Lily, swearing it was nothing, just a harmless fling. But how do you believe someone who has already lied to you? His words felt empty, hollow. He went about his days like nothing had changed. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I couldn't be. There was a part of me that still wanted to believe him, that thought maybe I was overreacting. But my heart, my instincts, told me otherwise. One evening, after dinner, I saw his phone buzz on the counter again. A text message. His face twitched when he saw it. But it was too late. I had already seen the name. Lily. I couldn't keep pretending. The facade was crumbling, and I was helpless to stop it. I asked him what the message said. He hesitated before replying, "It's nothing. Just work stuff." Work stuff? I knew better than that. But I didn't push him. Not yet. I knew this wasn't over. His calmness, his confidence in his lies, made me feel like I was losing control of my own life. I couldn't trust him anymore. And the hardest part was realizing that the man I had spent years loving was now a stranger. I was living with a ghost, a man who had already abandoned me emotionally while pretending to be there. It wasn't just the phone that kept raising alarms. It was everything. The way he looked at me with those rehearsed apologies, the way he tried to act like nothing was wrong, as though everything was still the same. The lies became a familiar pattern, as if he had learned how to play me. But I wasn't blind anymore. I wasn't going to let him pull the wool over my eyes. One day, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. It was a receipt for a hotel I had never heard of, one that didn't seem to exist in his story about late-night meetings. The receipt was dated a few days ago. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the rage building inside me. He hadn't even tried to hide it. When I confronted him with it, he was shocked. His excuses came pouring out. It was for work. You don't understand. But I saw the desperation in his eyes, the way his hands shook, the way his voice cracked. It didn't take much for the pieces to fall into place. The lies were falling apart, and he was scrambling to keep up the illusion. But I wasn't playing his game anymore. I knew then that he had been lying to me from the start. This wasn't a fling. This was an affair. I didn't speak for hours after that. The silence in our home felt suffocating. He tried to apologize, tried to explain himself, but his words were like poison. Sweet, convincing, but ultimately toxic. I could hear his voice, but it didn't reach me. I was already lost in my own thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened, what I had allowed to happen. How had I let it go on for so long? How had I missed the signs? He told me he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt me, but I couldn't bring myself to believe him. His apology felt like a band-aid over a wound that needed stitches. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process the flood of emotions that threatened to consume me. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a punch to my chest that knocked the breath out of me. In that silence, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let him destroy me. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to be the victim of this betrayal. I just didn't know how to move forward yet. But I knew one thing. I couldn't stay in this lie any longer. It had been weeks since I had confronted him, but every day felt like an eternity. He tried to act like everything was fine, like we could just go back to the way things were. But we couldn't. I had learned the truth, and it was a truth I couldn't ignore. Every touch felt like a reminder of the betrayal. Every word he said felt like a lie. I started noticing things I had never seen before. The way he avoided eye contact, the way he would leave the room when his phone rang, the way he no longer seemed interested in our life together. The person I thought I knew, the man I married, was slipping away, and in his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone I no longer wanted to be with. The hardest part wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that the man I had trusted for years had been deceiving me all along. It was the quiet death of something I had believed in so completely. It was the loss of a future I had imagined. The one where we grew old together, where we built a life. It was all gone, shattered by one woman, one lie, one betrayal, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. I spent days lost in thought, searching for answers that seemed elusive. I wanted to understand why. Why her? Why did he do this? What had I done wrong? But the answers never came. I couldn't find the reasons that made sense, the ones that could justify the pain. All I found was confusion, anger, and a deep sense of loss. I talked to friends, though I kept the details vague. I needed someone to hear me, to validate my feelings. But no one could give me the answers I wanted. Some told me to leave him. Some told me to forgive. But I knew the choice was mine. But I wasn't ready yet. I couldn't make the decision, not when everything felt so raw, so uncertain. I didn't know if I could ever trust him again. One thing was clear. I was no longer the same woman who had walked into this marriage. Something inside me had changed. I was still reeling from the truth, unsure of how to proceed. When he came to me with an apology, his eyes full of guilt, his words carefully measured. "I'm sorry, I made a huge mistake," he said, his voice low and full of remorse. But as he spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that his apology was a performance, a desperate attempt to hold on to something he knew was slipping away. I looked into his eyes, searching for the sincerity I so desperately wanted to see. But all I found was fear, fear of losing me, of losing everything he had built. He promised me it would never happen again, that he had learned his lesson. But I didn't know how to trust those words anymore. Trust, once shattered, is never easy to rebuild. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand that he explain himself, to make him see the depth of the damage he had caused. But another part of me just wanted the pain to stop feeling the weight of his betrayal. So I nodded, half-heartedly, trying to pretend that his words meant something. But in my heart, I knew that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that had led up to it, everything that had been broken long before that. Days passed in a blur of emotional exhaustion. I was torn between wanting to move forward and wanting to run as far away as possible. The thought of leaving him was unbearable, but the thought of staying in a marriage built on lies felt even worse. But I stayed, not because I was weak, not because I didn't have a choice, but because I needed to believe that we could work through this. I needed to believe that love could heal, that time could fix what had been broken. I didn't tell him everything I was feeling. I didn't want him to know how much I was hurting, how deeply his betrayal had scarred me. I didn't want to give him that power. So I stayed silent, pretending that things were normal. But inside, I was unraveling. Every touch, every word felt like a reminder of what he had done. The wound was still fresh, still raw, and I didn't know how long I could keep pretending that everything was okay. I wanted him to prove he was worth staying for, but I wasn't sure if he could. One evening, a few weeks after the confrontation, I found myself sitting at a cafe, trying to distract myself from the turmoil inside me. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, a man approached me. He was friendly, attractive, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of attention that wasn't tainted by betrayal. We started talking. He was kind, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my life. I felt an unexpected sense of comfort in his presence, as if he was a brief escape from the storm of emotions that had been consuming me. But as I looked at him, I realized something. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't looking for someone else. I was looking for validation, for a sense of worth that had been stripped away by my husband's infidelity. I didn't know if I was ready for a new relationship, but in that moment, I understood something important. I needed to find myself again. I couldn't keep relying on someone else for my happiness. I thanked the man for the conversation and left the cafe, feeling a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't about finding someone new. It was about finding peace within myself. As time went on, I found myself pulling further away from him. I couldn't look at him without seeing the man who had betrayed me. I couldn't listen to him without hearing the lies, the deceit that had become our new reality. It wasn't that I wanted to punish him. It was that I didn't know how to face him. I didn't know how to pretend that everything was okay when nothing was. I stopped speaking to him as much. I stopped asking him about his day, stopped pretending I didn't see the messages on his phone. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to feel like I was in a constant state of surveillance, always waiting for the next betrayal. His attempts to reach out, to engage me in conversation, felt like they were part of his performance. His need to convince me that everything was fine only pushed me further away. I was shutting down. Slowly, but surely. I was losing myself in this marriage, and I didn't know how to find my way back. One night, after yet another hollow apology from him, I reached my breaking point. It wasn't about the affair anymore. It wasn't about Lily. It was about the fact that he had never truly seen me, never truly valued me the way I deserved. The moment he left the room, I stood there in the silence, feeling like I was suffocating. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep living in this lie, this half-existence. I packed my things. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't know where I would go, or how I would survive. But I knew I couldn't stay here, in this house, with this man who had broken me. I heard him return, calling my name, asking where I was going. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. The door slammed behind me, and for the first time in months, I felt a small flicker of hope. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had ever experienced. I was left with nothing but a quiet apartment and the echoes of a life I thought I knew. It felt like I was starting from scratch, like I had to rebuild everything. My self-worth, my identity, my sense of who I was without him. The first week was the hardest. I cried more than I ever thought possible, and the silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I missed him, or at least the person I thought he was. But with every tear that fell, something inside me grew stronger. I spent hours reflecting on who I was before him, the person I had been before I had allowed myself to lose myself in him. Slowly, I began to remember the things I loved, the hobbies I had abandoned, the dreams I had put on hold. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for me. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to let go of the man I had loved, to let go of the life I had thought we would build together. But deep down, I knew it was the only way I would survive. The days turned into weeks, and the space between us grew wider. He tried calling me, sending texts, even showing up at my door with flowers. But I wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. I had moments of weakness, though. I thought about him at night, about the way we had once laughed together, about the love that felt so real. I missed him, but I couldn't forget what he had done. And every time I considered going back, a wave of guilt and anger would wash over me. How could I go back to someone who had betrayed me so completely? How could I return to a life built on lies? I knew I deserved more. I deserved honesty. I deserved someone who would never make me feel this small, this insignificant. And so, I resisted the temptation. The hardest part was not missing him, but knowing that, no matter how much I wanted things to go back to the way they were, they never could. I started seeing a therapist. I knew I needed help to navigate this new life, to understand what had happened and how to heal. The therapy sessions were tough at first, like peeling back layers of pain I had tried so hard to bury. But with each session, I began to understand more about myself, about my choices, and about the things I had ignored in my marriage. The hardest part of therapy wasn't confronting the affair. It was confronting the fact that I had allowed myself to stay in a relationship that wasn't healthy, that didn't serve me. I had spent so many years trying to make it work, convincing myself that love was enough. But love, I realized, wasn't enough when it wasn't built on trust and respect. I began to reclaim my independence. I found a new job that challenged me in ways I hadn't experienced in years. I reconnected with old friends who reminded me of who I was before I lost myself in my marriage. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive again. A few months after I had left, I ran into him at the grocery store. It wasn't planned, and I wasn't prepared for the emotions it would stir up. He looked different, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. He wasn't the confident man I had known. He was tired, broken, and vulnerable. "Hi," he said, his voice shaky. I wasn't sure what to say. The anger was still there, but so was the ache. The part of me that had loved him, that had wanted to believe in us. "How have you been?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I stared at him for a moment, unsure of what I was feeling. Anger? Sympathy? The mix of emotions was overwhelming. "I'm okay," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was a storm. "I'm doing fine." We exchanged a few more words, but the conversation felt forced, as though neither of us knew how to navigate this new dynamic. It wasn't the reunion I had imagined in my head, and it wasn't the closure I had hoped for. It was just awkward, and that was it. I turned and walked away, realizing that the chapter with him was truly over. As the months went by, I felt the weight of the past slowly lifting. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy, but I began to heal. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I started to forgive, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I forgave myself for staying too long, for ignoring the red flags. I forgave him, not because he asked for it, but because I needed to let go of the bitterness that had been holding me captive. And as I looked forward, I realized that I had learned something invaluable from this experience. I had learned that I could survive. I had learned that I was strong, even when I felt like I had lost everything. I had learned that I was enough. A year had passed since I left him, and though I was still healing, I began to see the world differently. I started to recognize the patterns in my life, the way I had given so much of myself to others, neglecting my own needs, my own happiness. It wasn't just about him. It was about me. I had lost sight of who I was in the pursuit of keeping the peace, of being the perfect wife. I began to focus on myself. I took weekend trips, went to concerts alone, and even learned how to cook meals I had always wanted to try. The more I focused on my own growth, the more I realized how much I had been missing out on. I wasn't just healing from the betrayal. I was rediscovering who I was beneath the hurt, beneath the layers of doubt that had built up over the years. It wasn't easy, but with each step, I felt freer. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly content with who I was. One of the hardest realizations was that I was facing the future alone. When we first married, I had envisioned a future filled with love, stability, and companionship. I had never considered that it would all fall apart. And yet, here I was, standing at the precipice of the unknown. I had moments of doubt. I had moments where I questioned whether I had made the right choice in leaving. What if things could have been fixed? What if we could have worked through the pain? But deep down, I knew that I was stronger now. I had learned to rely on myself, to trust my instincts. The fear of being alone didn't feel so terrifying anymore. I had my life back, and even if it meant facing the future without him, I was ready to take on whatever came next. I met someone new. It wasn't something I had been looking for, but it happened. He was kind, thoughtful, and everything I had needed after everything with my ex. We went on a few dates, and I allowed myself to feel something for him, though it was difficult at first. I couldn't help but compare him to my husband, wondering if this was another relationship doomed to fail. But I pushed those fears aside and allowed myself to enjoy his company. It felt different than my marriage, lighter, more genuine. There were no secrets, no betrayal hanging in the air. And yet, part of me was hesitant. I was still healing, still trying to understand what love truly meant after everything I had gone through. But with him, I felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, love could be simple again. As our relationship grew, so did my fears. I found myself pulling away at times, unable to fully let go of the walls I had built around myself. I couldn't help it. Trust, once broken, was a hard thing to rebuild. Even though he had never given me any reason to doubt him, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was setting myself up for another heartbreak. He could sense my hesitation. There were moments when I saw the concern in his eyes, when he asked if I was okay, if I was ready for this, and I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to say, yes, I'm ready to trust you, but another part of me wanted to protect myself from getting hurt again. But slowly, with time, I realized that I couldn't live in fear forever. I couldn't allow my past to dictate my future. So I took a leap of faith. I let myself trust again, not because I had all the answers, but because I knew that if I didn't, I would never be able to move forward. I had moved on, or so I thought. One evening, just as I was starting to feel settled in my new life, I received a call from him. His voice was shaky, uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked. I felt a lump form in my throat. My heart skipped a beat. What could he possibly want after everything? After everything he had done? I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to slam the door on him, to remind him of how he had ruined everything. But another part of me needed closure. I needed to understand why he was coming back now, after all this time. "I'm listening," I said, my voice steady but guarded. And so he told me. He confessed that he had never stopped loving me, that the affair was a moment of weakness, a mistake he regretted every day. He apologized once again, this time with a rawness I hadn't heard before. "I never wanted to lose you," he said, his voice full of regret. "But I knew I had. And I've been living with that for so long." I was torn. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he was truly sorry. But the other part of me, the stronger part, knew that I couldn't keep falling for his promises. I had heard those words too many times before. I had seen him apologize and say the same things, only to have it happen again. "I've moved on," I said softly, but firmly, "and I'm not looking back." The silence that followed was heavy. I could feel the weight of his regret, but I couldn't let it sway me. I had already made my decision. That call was a turning point. I had finally put the past behind me. His words didn't affect me the way they once would have. Instead of reopening old wounds, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I realized that I had spent so many years trying to fix something that was never meant to be fixed. I had survived. I had found my strength in the darkest moments, and now I was free. Free from the lies, free from the heartache. I didn't need him or his apologies to validate my worth. For the first time in years, I looked at myself in the mirror and felt proud of who I had become. Strong, independent, and unbroken. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. As time passed, I realized that the hardest part wasn't learning to trust others again. It was learning to trust myself. I had ignored so many red flags during my marriage, had overlooked my own intuition in favor of keeping the peace. I had allowed myself to believe that love would conquer all, even when it wasn't healthy. But now, I could hear my inner voice again. I could listen to my own instincts without doubt or fear. And that was empowering. It wasn't about seeking validation from anyone else. It was about recognizing my own worth, my own ability to make decisions that were best for me. I had come a long way from the woman who had stayed in a broken marriage, clinging to the hope that things would get better. Now, I trusted myself to make better choices, to never settle for less than I deserved. Just when I thought I had put everything behind me, he showed up again. This time, it wasn't a call or a text. He appeared on my doorstep one afternoon, looking worn and desperate. "I need to talk," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him I had no interest in his drama anymore. But the other part of me, the part that had spent years loving him, was curious. What could he possibly say now? With a sigh, I opened the door. "What do you want?" He stepped inside, his eyes searching mine. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said, his voice trembling. "I've realized how badly I've hurt you, how much I took you for granted, and I want to make it right." I listened as he spoke, hearing the regret in his words. But I didn't feel the same pull I once did. It wasn't that I didn't care for him anymore. It was that I no longer needed him to complete me. "I've moved on," I said, my voice firm, "and I think you need to do the same." For the first time, I could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't seeking forgiveness for me. He was seeking it for himself. He wanted to assuage his guilt, to heal the wounds he had caused himself. But I wasn't his therapist. I wasn't his emotional crutch anymore. "I'm glad you're getting help," I said softly, "but I can't be the one to fix you. You need to find your own path, just like I found mine." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, try to convince me to give him another chance. But instead, he nodded, a look of quiet acceptance crossing his face. "I understand," he said quietly. "I hope you're happy." "I am," I replied, and for the first time in years, I meant it. After he left, I stood there, my heart calm for the first time in a long while. It wasn't a relief, exactly. It was more of a quiet peace, a sense that everything was finally where it needed to be. I had done the hard work. I had faced the pain, the heartbreak, and the devastation. And now, I was free. I was free to live my life on my terms, to pursue my dreams without the shadow of betrayal hanging over me. I was free to love, to trust, and to be the person I had always been beneath the hurt. And in that moment, I realized that closure doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes, it comes from within. It was strange, adjusting to a new reality without him in my life. I had spent so many years building my world around him, that now I had to figure out who I was without him. But as the days passed, I began to thrive in ways I hadn't expected. I had always been a person who valued stability, but now I was embracing the unknown. I took up new hobbies, traveled to places I had always dreamed of, and began to see the world through fresh eyes. I had learned that my happiness didn't depend on anyone else. It came from within me. And as I continued moving forward, I realized something else, that this wasn't just a chapter in my life. It was the beginning of something new, something better. I didn't need him, or anyone, to complete me. I was already whole. I had always thought strength meant being unbreakable, never showing weakness, always holding it together. But now, I saw strength differently. True strength wasn't in pretending to be fine when I wasn't. It wasn't about putting on a brave face and carrying on as if nothing had ever happened. It was in allowing myself to feel, to cry when I needed to take time to heal. I had spent so many years suppressing my emotions, ignoring the hurt, thinking it would make me stronger. But now I knew that strength came from vulnerability. It came from embracing who I was, flaws, scars, and all. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly standing in my power. It was inevitable that I would run into him again. After all, we had shared years of our lives together. But when it happened, I was surprised by how calm I felt. It was at the grocery store, of all places. I had just grabbed a few items and was heading toward the checkout when I spotted him. He was standing in the aisle, looking lost in thought, as if he hadn't seen me yet. I took a deep breath, unsure of what to do. For a moment, I considered turning around and walking the other way. But then I realized, why should I let him have any more power over me? So, I walked up to him. He looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Hey," he replied, his voice almost apologetic. For a brief moment, I saw the old tenderness in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to sway me. "How have you been?" He hesitated. "I've been working through things, trying to make things right with myself." I nodded, but didn't feel the need to say anything else. I had moved on. This conversation didn't need to be any more than a simple exchange. "Well, I hope you find the peace you're looking for," I said, then gave him a small smile before walking past him, leaving the past where it belonged. As I reflected on the encounter, I realized how far I had come. The woman who once would have been rattled by seeing him was now someone who could face the past with grace and strength. It wasn't about forgiving him anymore. It was about embracing my own journey, learning, growing, and moving forward. I had already forgiven myself for staying too long, for allowing myself to be blinded by love. Now, I was living my truth, and that was worth celebrating. I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the lessons life had taught me, even the painful ones. They had shaped me into the person I was becoming, someone who was unafraid to take control of her own destiny. Living alone had been an adjustment at first. The silence of the house felt heavy, almost deafening. But as time passed, I began to enjoy it. There was something liberating about having my own space, about not having to answer to anyone. I could wake up when I wanted, cook meals that satisfied only me, and decorate the house however I liked. There were no compromises anymore. And for the first time, I felt truly free. I started to appreciate the quiet moments, the mornings with coffee, the evenings spent reading, the nights out with friends. I didn't need a partner to make my life complete. I had everything I needed within myself. One of the greatest gifts I gave myself after everything was the chance to rediscover my passions. Before, I had been so wrapped up in being the perfect wife, in catering to his needs, that I had put my own dreams on hold. But now, with the freedom to do whatever I pleased, I began to explore the things I had always loved. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I took up yoga, went for long walks, and found myself getting lost in creative projects. The joy of doing things purely for myself was something I had forgotten existed. And as I embraced these passions, I realized something else. I didn't need anyone's approval to pursue my dreams. I was capable of creating a life I loved all on my own. I met someone new. It wasn't anything dramatic or sudden, but over time, we had become friends. He was different from anyone I had ever known. He was kind, thoughtful, and funny. But what really drew me to him was how comfortable he made me feel in my own skin. There were no games, no hidden agendas. For once, I felt seen for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. And that was a beautiful thing. Still, I didn't rush into anything. I took my time, allowing the relationship to develop naturally. I wasn't looking for validation or salvation. I was simply looking for companionship, for someone to share my journey with, if that was what was meant to happen. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to let someone in. The further I moved from my past, the more I realized that it had no hold on me anymore. I didn't need him to be a part of my story for me to be whole. I had spent so long trying to make sense of what went wrong, trying to fix things that couldn't be fixed. But now, I saw it clearly. What happened wasn't a reflection of me. It was a reflection of his choices. I could let go of the past, not because I had forgiven him, but because I had forgiven myself. I had given myself permission to move on, to live my life without carrying the weight of past mistakes. And for the first time in years, I felt lighter. I had spent months, maybe even years, trying to heal from the betrayal, trying to mend the broken parts of myself that had been shattered by his actions. But healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple apology, or even by moving on. It was a journey, a winding road full of setbacks, revelations, and growth. Some days, I felt strong, like I had it all figured out. Other days, I questioned everything, unsure of who I was without the man I had once loved. But I was learning that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about accepting the imperfections, about embracing the pain and allowing it to shape me into someone stronger. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I had healed. Not completely, not in the way I had expected, but in a way that had made me whole again. I was no longer defined by the betrayal. I was defined by my resilience, my ability to overcome, and my willingness to grow. I had healed, not because he had apologized or because the pain was gone, but because I had chosen to heal on my own terms. After everything, I found myself wondering if I would ever truly love again. Could I trust someone enough to open my heart? Would I be able to give my all to another person after everything I had been through? But then I realized that love isn't a destination. It's a journey. It's not about finding someone to complete me. It's about growing together, supporting one another, and building a connection based on trust and respect. I had to learn that love wasn't perfect. It was messy, flawed, and sometimes painful, but it was also beautiful, fulfilling, and worth fighting for. So, I didn't rush into anything. I gave myself permission to take my time, to explore what love could mean in this new chapter of my life. Whether it was with someone else or with myself, I was open to whatever came my way. Love didn't have to look the same as it did before. It could be better, healthier, more authentic. And that was enough for me. When I looked around at my life, at the people I had in it, the choices I had made, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. I had come so far from the woman who had been broken and lost. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, learning who I truly was, independent of anyone else. The apartment I lived in was mine, my sanctuary, a place where I could be myself without fear of judgment. My friends were genuine, loyal, and supportive. I was surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not who I was supposed to be. And while I hadn't forgotten the past, I had learned to let go of it. I had made peace with what had happened, with the pain I had experienced. It no longer controlled me. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. In the past, I had often silenced myself. I had stayed quiet when something bothered me, put up with things that made me uncomfortable, and allowed others to take the lead. But now, I was learning to speak up. I was learning to find my voice, to stand up for myself and demand the respect I deserved. I wasn't afraid to set boundaries anymore, to say no when something didn't feel right. I no longer feared conflict or confrontation because I knew that I was worthy of being heard. And as I spoke my truth, I realized how much I had stifled myself in the past. No longer. I had a voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me again. The freedom I had gained wasn't something I had anticipated. I had thought that leaving him, leaving the past behind, would bring me a sense of relief. And it did in a way. But what I didn't realize was that freedom also brought with it responsibility. The responsibility to take ownership of my life, to make decisions that were in my best interest, and to walk away from anything or anyone who didn't serve me. It was empowering and terrifying all at once. For the first time, I was fully responsible for my own happiness. I couldn't blame anyone else for my choices, for the life I had built. It was a lot to carry, but I knew I was capable of handling it. I had spent so long hating him, resenting him for what he had done to me. But over time, I realized that holding on to that anger wasn't hurting him. It was hurting me. I wasn't ready to forgive him for everything, not right away. But I was ready to forgive myself. I had blamed myself for staying too long, for allowing myself to be deceived. But I had been doing the best I could at the time. I had loved him, and I had trusted him. There was no shame in that. And so, I forgave myself. I let go of the guilt and the shame, and I chose to move forward without the weight of those emotions. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. Looking back, I realized that I had been living someone else's version of my story for too long. I had allowed his actions, his choices, to define who I was. But now, I was rewriting my story. I was the author of my own life, and I was no longer going to let anyone else hold the pen. I wasn't defined by my past. I wasn't defined by the mistakes I had made or the heartbreak I had suffered. I was defined by who I was becoming, the strong, resilient woman who had survived it all and was thriving in spite of it. I was no longer a victim of circumstances. I was the hero of my own story. The more I lived in my own skin, the more I realized how freeing independence truly was. It was in the moments of silence, the stillness when I didn't have to answer to anyone, that I felt most alive. I had spent so many years trying to be everything for him, always giving, always adapting. But now, I was simply living for myself, and that was enough. I didn't need approval, validation, or anyone else's opinion to feel complete. I had learned that independence wasn't about isolation. It was about self-sufficiency, knowing who I was and standing in my own truth. And as I embraced that strength, I realized it was the most powerful thing I had ever experienced. Trust had been shattered for me in ways I couldn't have imagined. After everything that had happened, how could I trust anyone again? But I was slowly learning. Not all men were like him. Not all relationships were built on lies. I couldn't let one person's betrayal rob me of the ability to trust the goodness of others. I started small. I opened up to my friends, shared my thoughts and fears, and allowed myself to be vulnerable. I didn't expect perfection, but I trusted that they would be there for me. And in that trust, I began to heal further. It wasn't easy, but step by step, I was rebuilding the foundation of trust in my life, one relationship at a time. Looking ahead, I realized how much I had grown. The future no longer seemed like a daunting unknown. It was full of possibilities, full of choices that I was free to make. There were no more constraints, no more fears holding me back. I could go anywhere, do anything, and be anyone I wanted to be. I had learned so much from the pain, the betrayal, and the heartache. But I had also learned to embrace the beauty of life's unpredictability. There was no map, no plan, just the endless horizon of opportunities stretching out before me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready to take on whatever came next. As I reflect on everything that's happened, on the pain, the anger, the heartbreak, I realize that this chapter of my life is coming to a close. The woman I was when it all began is no more. The woman sitting here today, telling you this story, is stronger, wiser, and free. And I'm not looking back. I've let go of the hurt, the resentment, and the fear. I've found peace in my own strength and power. I don't need anyone to complete me because I am whole. The story may have started with betrayal, but it ends with me reclaiming my life. And that, my dear, is the most beautiful ending of all.